Professor Mounk, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Let me start right away with the first question. In your analysis, what are the key historical events that have contributed to the rise of populism in the US, and how do they compare it to similar moments in other democracies?
Yeah, so I think the only way to think about it sensibly is to compare to different countries. Different factors play a slightly bigger role in different places, but broadly speaking, I think there's commonalities. So when I first gave my account of this in the People versus Democracy, which was published in 2018, I focused on three different factors. The first is the stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens in many democracies, particularly in Western Europe and North America. So the fact that in the immediate post-war era in particular, when many of these democracies stabilized, people really felt like the possibilities in life were completely different from those of their parents. That I think is no longer the case for most citizens of those countries, at least today. Secondly, I talked about the rapid cultural and demographic transformations in many of those countries, both their ethnic diversification, but also, for example, the much bigger role played by women in society, the much greater acceptance for sexual minorities, which of course I see as a positive thing, but which elicits fears in parts of the population that feel that their social status has declined, that they used to enjoy a certain kind of status in society that we can no longer take for granted. And then finally, the rise of internet and of social media, which makes it easier for populist parties and candidates to present themselves, to build political movements, but also, of course, shifts public opinion in making it easier to spread hatred and lies and so on the internet. Today, I would add a fourth factor to that, which is partially mediated by social media, but also I think has to do with a deterioration in governance, and that is the felt distance between ordinary people and the elite. The sense that elites are, in some places, quite corrupt, but in many places, very culturally distant from average citizens, that they live in their separate places, move in their separate circles, and have come to look down on average citizens. And that, I think, is a factor that I didn't emphasize as much originally, to which I would give greater weight now as well.
Right. You have written extensively about the erosion of democratic norms. How has the US unique political culture contributed to the vulnerability of these institutions to populist movements?
Well, again, I mean, this is something that we're seeing in many different countries at the same time, and that seems to suggest that the most universally relevant factor, internet and social media, has something to do with that. The ability to reach voters directly on social media platforms and to make appeals to them that work best if they're emotional, if they're off a cuff, if they're polarizing, has contributed a lot to the breaking of those norms. And social media platforms play a very large role in that. When you look specifically at the United States, I think polarization plays a significant role. The primary system, which makes the job of most congressmen and many senators more dependent on keeping the goodwill of 5 to 10% of the population that are the decisive factor in primary elections, rather than on the median voter who decides elections in closely contested seats or states, of which there's not that many, plays a significant role as well.
Right. Economic inequality is often cited as a driver of populism. To what extent do you believe the economic policies of the last few decades have fueled populist sentiments in the US?
So certainly, the economy plays a role. As I was saying earlier, it has helped to explain, or it helps to explain, why we see an erosion of what political scientists call output legitimacy. While people used to say, I don't know whether I trust politicians, when I really believe in what they're saying, but in the end, they seem to be delivering for us. And now many people say they haven't been delivering for us, so why should we trust them? Well, perhaps we should try something new. How bad could things get? However, I think that cultural factors probably play a bigger role than economic factors. I mean, what you'd expect is that if economic factors are primary, then people should vote for populist parties that primarily talk about the economy, and perhaps about ones that are on the left. This happened in Greece with Syriza, where the economic concern, I think, was primary. In a very different vein, on the right, it happened with Milei in Argentina, because you were dealing with hyperinflation. So under those circumstances, economic problems seem to be at the root of the rise of populism in a much more direct way, and it gave rise to these very different populist movements centered around economic solutions. For the most part, that is not the case. When you listen to the speeches of Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen and Narendra Modi and Recep Erdogan, they of course talk about the economy, and they of course make promises about the economy, but the primary appeal is a cultural one. It is to proudly incarnate the moral and religious traditions of the majority, of a supposed majority, sometimes a real majority, that that feels like it has been sidelined, that feels like its preferences haven't sufficiently shaped the public culture of the country in which they live.
How has the changing demographic landscape in the US influenced the rise of populism, and what role does identity politics play in this phenomenon?
Yeah, so we need to distinguish between immigration and demographic change. I think immigration plays a big role in the United States and in many European countries. Most Americans, most Europeans, or many Europeans, are perfectly willing to see the benefits of migration. Many of them recognize that the countries need highly qualified migrants to come to their country for economic reasons, and that they bring real benefits. But it is also clear from opinion polls that at this point, for a good number of decades, majorities of the population have wanted to have less rather than more migration, and they feel that moderate and established political parties have ignored that preference, and they're angry not so much at the presence of immigrants as at the sense that they have no control over who comes in, and they have no control over borders. And that, I think, is a big part of the appeal of Donald Trump right now in the United States. I mean, he is building his case for re-election on the high inflation during the Biden administration, but also very strongly on the inflow of migrants over the last years. So this, I think, is a real vulnerability for moderate political parties, a real reason why they have lost credibility among ordinary voters. That is a slightly different question from demographic change. It's of course related, but I do think it's conceptually distinct in an important way. And there I would say that there's been a more roundabout problem for moderate political parties, and particularly the left in the United States, which is that Democrats had a very demographic view of the electorate. In the years when George W. Bush seemed dominant, they latched onto this hope that white voters predominantly vote for Republicans, non-white voters predominantly vote for Democrats, and as the demographic balance in the country starts to shift, as the number of white voters declines, that will give them these inevitable electoral victories. And so they became very focused on this emerging demographic majority. But that hasn't turned out as expected. It was meant to ensure that Hillary Clinton would win in 2016, and yet Donald Trump won the Electoral College, even if he didn't win the popular vote. It was meant to shift the electorate towards Biden in 2020. But in the event, Biden actually improved his share of the vote among white voters, but Trump significantly improved his share of the vote among non-white voters, particularly, but not only among Latinos. And this false assumption that victory was just going to fall into their lap has, I think, been a real strategic problem for Democrats, because it made them believe that they can dispense with any difficult trade-offs. They had a theory of the electorate where they were saying, non-white voters are our base, non-white voters are very progressive, we don't have to moderate on any of our unpopular issues in order to win, because these are the views of the future. But that failed to understand that historically non-white voters among the Democratic electorate were actually much more moderate or even conservative than white voters. if you're conservative and white, you probably vote for Republicans. If you're conservative and black or conservative and Latino, often you did vote for Democrats because you might not have felt welcome in the Republican Party. But this actually meant that the leftward drift of the Democratic Party has pushed many of those voters away. And the demographic majority that they anticipated has not materialized, particularly many working-class Latinos and some working-class Asian Americans and increasingly working-class African Americans are tempted to vote for the Republican Party, and that is one of the reasons why Trump continues to be competitive. The same, of course, is true in other countries like Brazil, which is majority non-white. And if non-white voters systematically refused to vote for Jair Bolsonaro, he would never have won his presidential election. He was competitive in part because he did have strong backing among particularly evangelical non-white voters, including among some of the less affluent segments of Brazilian society.
In your writings, you discuss the role of misinformation and media in the spread of populist ideas. How has the US media landscape, particularly the rise of social media, impacted the populist narrative?
Look, I think there's certainly a structural transformation that's very important, which is, the diversification of media. Famously 30 or 40 years ago, or perhaps at this point 50 or 60 years ago, there was the 4 big broadcast networks, and most people got their news from those. Later, you had the introduction of cable news, which started to polarize the sources of information and made it much easier to have purely partisan opinion programs, broadcast programs, and that was an important transformation. And then, of course, you had the rise of social media, of podcasts, of YouTube channels, of talk radio before that, which really grew in importance. And today, Fox News is no longer that important a factor. In prime time, 300,000 or 400,000 Americans watch Fox News. The Joe Rogan podcast can have 5-6 million people listening to an episode. And Tucker Carlson appears to have actually increased his audience since he left Fox News and started distributing his show by himself, on YouTube, on X, and other platforms. And that certainly helps to explain both the irresponsible and the partisan nature of so much of our media today. At the same time, I'm a little bit concerned about the profligate use of the term misinformation. Often we refer to misinformation when we simply mean a view of a world that we disagree with or that we have misgivings about. And some of the principal positions that were censored as being misinformation in the last years actually turned out to have some truthfulness, or at least some plausibility. So, for example, during the pandemic, scientists were heavily censored if they speculated about the possibility that COVID originated in gain-of-function research in labs, that it may have been a lab leak, not a deliberate one, but an inadvertent one of a scientist mishandling these dangerous biological materials. Now this theory is taken seriously by mainstream news outlets and by many federal agencies in the United States. But that was perhaps the most prominent use of a term of misinformation in order to shut down a debate. And I think it should make us quite self-critical about whether we've defined the term carefully, whether we have the right precautions in place to ensure that we don't apply to things that turn out to be plausible or true. And so I think we would do very well to treat that term with more skepticism than it currently gets.
Populism in the US has been linked to a growing distrust in traditional institutions. What socio-political factors do you believe are most responsible for the erosion of trust?
What? Sorry, could you repeat that?
Populism in the US has been linked to a growing distrust in traditional institutions. What socio-political factors do you believe are most responsible for the erosion of trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about that question all along in a way. I mean, it goes back to a lack of output performance. It goes back to the sense among a segment of a population that they've been deprived of a social status that they once had and that in their minds they naturally deserve. It has to do with the fact that on social media, it's both easier to point out actual failings of the governing elites, which have always been imperfect, but whose flaws are much more on display now than they were in the past. And it makes it easier for irresponsible actors to rise to positions of responsibility or to lie about the failings of institutions, to take out of context a decision of an institution and make it seem horrendous or obviously incompetent when perhaps there's genuine reasons for why it acted in the way it did. So I think the answer to the loss of trust is the answer to the rise of populism.
In your article, The End of History Revisited, you argue in the conclusion, and I quote, "It follows that the tempting phrase, the end of history, is for now premature." End of the quote. It seems that you give credit to the thesis of the end of history. Do you think the thesis is still valid?
So what I argue in that article is that we have to distinguish between two claims in Fukuyama's seminal article. The first one is that there was a time in which there was genuine ideological competitors to liberal democracy. In the middle of the 20th century, fascism and communism, each in their different ways, genuinely challenged liberal democracy and had a self-consciously articulated alternative vision for a legitimate regime form. And those failed, and they failed terribly. So at the point Fukuyama's writing, he argued the only grand theory about legitimate government that was left standing, but had genuine international appeal, was liberal democracy. And that, to him, was the end of history. The second claim, which was implicit, was that liberal democracies would be quite good at solving their internal problems, that liberal democracies, unlike those alternative regime forms, would prove to be very stable. Now, on the first thesis, I think that so far he has proven right. I don't know if he's right that we'll never see an alternative regime form that can generally compete with liberal democracy. But when you look around the world today, I think it is true that liberal democracy remains the only genuinely legitimate regime form. The alternative candidates to it each have huge limitations of their own. You have a form of Shia theocracy in Iran, but that doesn't really appeal to anybody outside of the Muslim world or really outside of the Shia world. And it is, in significant trouble even there, even within the Iranian population itself. You have a number of strongman leaders like Vladimir Putin in Russia that might appeal to a few people of authoritarian predilections around the world. But I don't think anybody in the world is saying, let's adopt the Russian model. Let's turn ourselves into Russia. It's just not working like that. You have China as a genuine geopolitical and economic, and perhaps at some point cultural competitor to the West. But while the Chinese model works rather well in theory, it's a mess in practice. It's completely unclear how it could ever be exported. Would people in Zimbabwe agree to be governed in the way that China is governed if it meant the level of wealth and the level of development that China has had? Probably yes. Would they agree to let their leaders implement the Chinese model? No, because it's unclear what that would entail. And while they would trust those people to centralize power in the way that the CCP has in Beijing, they wouldn't trust them to deliver, because the Chinese model builds on 3,000 years of Mandarin meritocracy and 100 years of a centralized communist party and 30 years of a weird form of capitalism that pretends to be socialist or communist, even as it actually marketizes everything, including retirements and healthcare. So it's just completely unclear what it would mean to copy that somewhere else. And so you see the continuing legitimacy of liberal democracy by the fact that very clearly non-liberal and non-democratic regimes pretend to be both of those things. There's a lot of intellectual energy in China nowadays into showing why China is the true democracy. You don't do that if you have a self-conscious ideological alternative to the governing paradigm. Where I think Fukuyama may have been overly sanguine is in his predictions about liberal democracy being stable at home. So that regime form is still the only legitimate one with genuine mass appeal around the world, but it is much more embattled at home and it's much less popular at home than it was in the past. And that, I think, helps to explain some of the sense of chaos and uncertainty in our political moment.
In the same article, you underline, and I quote, while there has of late been extensive speculation about the future of liberal democracies, there has been far less reflection of how dictatorships that issue from populism may fare in the long run, end of the quote. In the year 2024, where populist movements all over Europe are on the rise, do you think we can now predict the future of populist parties more accurately, or is it still very difficult?
Well, so I think it's clear that populism is now one of the main modes of politics, if you want, and populist political parties are some of the biggest party families around the world, some of them on the left, but mostly on the right. And when you look at the European Parliament, you see that various incarnations of populist right politics are now one of the very big blocks all across Europe. And that's true not only in the European Parliament, but in national parliaments, which are more consequential as well, of course. The question is what happens when populists actually win elections and start to govern. And here I think we've seen a very different paths over the last decades. So we've seen on the one side places like Venezuela and perhaps Turkey, in which populist leaders have undermined democratic institutions to such an extent that there either are no free and fair elections at all, as in the case of Venezuela, or where it's come to be genuinely in doubt whether the opposition can still oust the sitting president or prime minister by democratic means, as in the case of Turkey. You have, secondly, a set of countries where these populist movements have significantly undermined democratic institutions, wreaked real havoc, limited free speech, decimated independent institutions, but in which elections clearly still remain meaningful, in which they are mostly free, even if they are no longer fair. And the world's biggest democracy, India, is probably an example of that. And then finally, you have some countries in which populists have, at least for now, failed, in which they were in government, but despite the ways in which they handicapped the opposition was able to throw them out through elections. That was the case in Brazil, it was the case in Poland, and it was, at least in 2020, the case in the United States. But of course, as the American case indicates, that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. Trump now has about a 45% chance, according to betting markets, of regaining power through the ballot box in a matter of weeks. And so I think that we need to both recognize that there's a very large variance in outcome when populists take over, and we need to stop thinking of democracy in 1 and 0. We don't have perfect democracies that will continue to be perfect if only the populists lose. And when populists win, that doesn't mean that these democracies imminently die and are over and it's the end of the story. Most of the time, they seriously damage democracy, but the extent to which they do that and how lastingly they do that depends on a lot of complex local circumstances.
All right. In your article written back in 2017, European disunion, what the rise of populist movements means for democracy, you argue, and I quote, "We have made real progress in understanding the nature of populism, moderate progress in analyzing its causes, and barely any progress in identifying its potential remedies. In the year 2024, do you think we now have some remedies, or are we at a total loss?"
I don't remember writing that article or that line, but I stand by it 100%. And sadly, I don't think it's changed very much since 2017.
Right. Before the presidential debate last Tuesday in the United States, you wrote that Americans view Harris too progressive. Tonight, maybe her last best chance to course correct. Harris is on track to lose the election. What do you think right now after the debate? Will she win or lose the elections?
Well, as I said earlier, betting markets, the last time I checked, gave Trump about a 45% chance of winning and Harris about a 55% chance of winning. She did do well in the debate. It always helps to remind the American electorate of just how irresponsible and chaotic and demagogic Trump is, because though that has some adherents, most Americans do not like that. And so the fact that Harris came across as competent and collected while the spotlight was on Trump, and he made a series of outrageous claims and did not control himself very well and got angry, all helped her significantly. But the election continues to be very close run. And I still think that there are things that Kamala Harris and the Democrats could do to both increase the chance of victory in November and to start building a much broader coalition. Because what we need to actually end Donald Trump's political career and the broader danger that his form of MAGA-inspired politics represents is a much bigger electoral coalition that is able to durably and clearly win in a series of elections that then force the Republican Party to transform itself. And by the way, that's true inversely as well. The Republicans managed to move to a more moderate plane. They could force Democrats to do that. I think it is fine for Democrats to be somewhat left-leaning on the economy. I think most Americans, as well as most Europeans, want a robust welfare state. They want robust state action to make sure that there's wage growth for lower earners, even though they clearly also believe in a market economy, and they clearly also care a lot about economic growth. And those two things, I think, can be combined. But on culture, it is quite clear that most Americans think that the Democratic Party is now out of whack with the American mainstream. I don't personally share this opinion, of course, but more Americans say that Kamala Harris is too left, is too progressive, than say that Donald Trump is too conservative. And to combat that problem, Democrats, I think, need to champion the values of inclusion and tolerance, which are non-negotiable, but also make some cultural concessions to both where public opinion lies and often where common sense is located.
What will happen to American liberal democracy if Donald Trump is re-elected on November the 5th?
So there's two very different prognostications. One is to say that he was in power for 4 years and that turned out to be damaging and nasty, but less consequential than some of us, including me, would have thought in 2016. That America has a number of strengths compared to other democracies that did end up playing an important role, including the deeply federal system, which distributes power to governors, many of whom would continue to be Democrats, including the many veto points to passing legislation, which made it possible for Democrats, especially after the midterm elections in 2018, to block a lot of what Trump wanted to do, including an economy that is sufficiently rich and a media landscape that is sufficiently developed that it's hard for the state to capture it. reducing incentives to sort of comply with the diktats of the person in the executive seat. And all of the strengths, I think, would continue to be there. At the same time, there are also some ways in which Trump would be more dangerous now than he was in 2016. To start off with, at the time, he had no political experience. He did not have a trusted team of people who actually shared his worldview. He barely had control over his own Republican Party, which was at the time constituted of many representatives and senators who were publicly ambivalent about him and privately disdained him. And he didn't have a clear sense of institutional transformations that he wanted to make. I think all of these things are now different. He has 4 years of experience in executive office. He has built a deep bench of loyalists who would be willing to do his bidding from day one. The Republican Party has transformed itself. There's been a lot of personnel turnover. A lot of the people who are now in the House of Representatives and a good number of people who are now in the Senate ran as Trump Republicans and won primaries as Trump Republicans. So they're much more aligned with his political agenda. And many of the rest of them have made a political turn where they've cast the lot in with Donald Trump because they realized that was the price of survival in Republican politics. You know, he has a deep bench of loyalists who've actually been in office with him at this point, perhaps in lower positions initially, but who understand how the federal bureaucracy works. And finally, you know, he's out for revenge. He has a sense that the institutions hampered what he was able to do and came after him when he was out of office. And now it's time to dismantle them, to make sure that what he calls the deep state can no longer contain him. And so these are all reasons to think that a second Trump presidency would be more dangerous than the first. How these two factors shake out, you know, how much damage he would in fact manage to wreak, I think is both hard to predict and may ultimately depend on happenstance, including the amount of discipline he will bring to bear on actually transforming the system, something that thankfully is in doubt.
Okay, Professor Mounk, lastly, academicians like Stephen Levitsky and Kurt Weiland argue that democracies have shown time and again resilience on the face of populist threat. However, institutions like VDEM strongly argue that democracy is under serious threat. Where do you stand in this debate?
Perhaps somewhere in between, which is to say that it is interesting that some of the objective metrics that you might look at to gauge how democratic a country is seem to be faring a lot better than some of the subjective metrics, like the ratings from VDEM or Freedom House or other kind of rating institutions. So when you look at how many journalists are in jail, when you look at how long governments are in office, when you look at how many people have broken or repealed term limits, there doesn't seem to be a significant change. I think the best paper on this is by two other political scientists, Little and Mang. At the same time, you might wonder whether those statistics capture the extent of polarization, the extent of breakdown of more informal political norms, and the extent of the danger that is around the corner. You might think that in a country like the United States, we're certainly not at a point where journalists are being jailed, but we may be 2 or 3 steps before the point when newspapers start to fall into line. So I think that this recent research is a necessary corrective and a helpful corrective to some of the pessimism in the field. It should make us analyze a little bit more carefully, and it should make us a little bit more optimistic that we may be able to get through that moment. But it certainly isn't a reason to stop being alarmed altogether.
Professor Mounk, thank you so very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this.